Episode 7, The Seventh-day Adventists. Today, we're not talking about Mormonism directly, but we are talking about another story that came just after it, the Seventh-day Adventist movement. Because before Joseph Smith started the Mormon Church, America had already been primed by decades of religious upheaval. The First Great Awakening in the 1700s shattered the dominance of traditional churches, insisting that faith had to be personal, emotional, and lived, not just recited from a pulpit. Then came the Second Great Awakening in the early 1800s, where revivals, camp meetings, and fiery preaching spread like wildfire across the frontier. But with all that passion came fragmentation. Denominations multiplied, doctrines clashed, and ordinary believers were left asking, which church was right? The awakenings proved people were hungry for God, but they also left behind confusion, division, and a deep yearning for something more authentic. It was out of this spiritual chaos that the Restoration movement emerged. Leaders like Barton W. Stone and Alexander Campbell declaring that Christianity had drifted from its roots and that the only solution was to return to the purity of the New Testament church. From the collapse of Millerism and the heartbreak of the Great Disappointment emerged a movement that refused to die, the Seventh-day Adventist Church. What set them apart from the Millerites who came before? Let's find out. Part 1. From Millerism to Sabbatarianism. After William Miller's prediction that Jesus would return in 1844 failed, a moment known as the Great Disappointment, many followers were devastated. Among them was Hiram Edson, a farmer and devout Millerite, who claimed to have had a vision in a cornfield the morning after October 22nd. He concluded that Miller's calculations were accurate, but his interpretation of Daniel 8 verse 14 was flawed. Christ had not returned to earth, but had entered the most holy place of the heavenly sanctuary. This revelation became the cornerstone of the Seventh-day Adventist Church's distinctive doctrine of the investigative judgment, a heavenly review of every person's life, beginning in 1844, to determine who would be saved and to demonstrate God's justice to the universe. While adherents continued to anticipate Christ's imminent second coming, they refrained from setting new dates, citing Revelation 10:6's warning that there should be time no longer. As early Adventists worked to define their core teachings, the question of the biblical day of rest and worship came to the forefront. The foremost proponent of Sabbath-keeping among early Adventists was Joseph Bates. Bates was introduced to the Sabbath doctrine through a tract written by Millerite preacher Thomas M. Preble, who had himself been influenced by Rachel Oakes Preston, a young Seventh-day Baptist. This teaching gradually gained acceptance and became the subject of the first edition of the church publication, The Present Truth, which appeared in July 1849. With foundational doctrines taking shape, the early Adventist movement faced a new challenge. It needed dedicated leaders to guide, organize, and spread these emerging beliefs. Out of this critical moment stepped three individuals whose vision, commitment, and courage would define early Adventism and shape the church's future: Joseph Bates, James White, and Ellen G. White. Part 2. The Triad of Adventism. Shattered by failed prophecy, the struggling Adventist movement needed heroes, and three emerged: Joseph Bates, James White, and Ellen G. White. Together, they would shape Adventism forever. But who were they, and how did they change everything? Joseph Bates. Joseph Bates was born on July 8, 1792, in Rochester, Massachusetts. His father had served as a volunteer in the Revolutionary War, and his mother was the daughter of Barnabas Nye of Sandwich. In 1793, the family moved to New Bedford, in the area that would later become the township of Fairhaven in 1812. In 1811, Bates was pressed into service with the British Navy and spent time as a prisoner during the War of 1812. After his release, he returned to maritime life and eventually rose to command his own ship. On one voyage, a Bible packed by his wife sparked a profound spiritual awakening. Reading it led him to embrace a variety of reform movements, marking the beginning of a life dedicated to faith and moral conviction. After the Great Disappointment of October 22, 1844, Bates, like many Millerites, struggled to make sense of the failed prophecy. When he encountered a pamphlet by T.M. Preble and embraced the seventh-day Sabbath, From that point on, he became known as the Apostle of the Sabbath, writing influential works including the Seventh-day Sabbath, a perpetual sign in 1846. One of Bates's most enduring contributions was linking the Sabbath to the heavenly sanctuary, a theological vision that would later evolve into Adventism's great controversy theme. James S. White. James White was born on August 4, 1821, in Palmyra, Maine, the fifth of 9 children. Frail and sickly as a child, he endured frequent fits and seizures. Poor eyesight limited his education, and he was required to labor on the family farm. At 16, however, his vision improved, allowing him to enroll in a local academy. He earned a teaching certificate in the common branches and briefly taught at an elementary school. At the age of 15, he was baptized into the Christian Connection, a movement we explored in Episode 3 during the Stone Revival, which emphasized simple, Bible-centered faith. White's exposure to the Millerite message came from his parents. After hearing fervent preaching at an Advent camp meeting in Exeter, Maine, he resolved to leave teaching and dedicate himself to ministry. In 1843, he was ordained as a minister in the Christian Connection. From the pulpit, White proved to be a formidable preacher. During the winter of 1843 alone, his sermons led 1,000 people to embrace the Millerite message. Yet his zeal sometimes provoked hostile reactions. Angry mobs would throw snowballs at him during his travels. It was during these early ministry journeys that he met Ellen G. Harmon, who would become his wife on August 30, 1846, beginning a lifelong partnership in ministry. Ellen G. White, Ellen Gold White, and her twin sister, Elizabeth, were born on November 26, 1827, to Robert and Eunice Harmon in Gorham, Maine, along State Route 114. Ellen was the 7th of 8 children. Her father farmed and also crafted hats using mercuric nitrate, a chemical mixture of mercury and nitrate which made the household unusually hazardous. Ellen's childhood was marked by hardship. At the age of 9, while attending Brackett Street School in Portland, Maine, she was struck in the face by a stone. She later described this injury as the spark of her spiritual awakening. This misfortune, which for a time seemed so bitter and was so hard to bear, has proved to be a blessing in disguise. The cruel blow which blighted the joys of earth was the means of turning my eyes to heaven. I might never have known Jesus, had not the sorrow that clouded my early years led me to seek comfort in him. A few years later, Ellen and her parents attended a Methodist camp meeting in Buxton, Maine, where at the age of 12, she experienced a profound conversion and deep sense of peace. By 1840, her family had become involved with the Millerite movement. Listening to William Miller's lectures, Ellen was gripped by guilt over her sins and consumed by terror at the thought of eternal damnation. For months, she spent nights in tears and fervent prayer, fully absorbed by the anxiety of the second coming. On June 26, 1842, she was baptized by John Hobart in Casco Bay, Portland, Maine, and eagerly awaited Christ's return. She later recalled this period as the happiest time of her life, even though her family's Millerite beliefs led to their disfellowshipment from the local Methodist Church. At age 17, shortly after the Millerite Great Disappointment of 1844, Ellen claimed she began experiencing visions, marking the beginning of her role as a spiritual leader. In February 1845, she met James Springer White, a fellow Millerite who recognized the authenticity of her supposed visions. That winter, Ellen and James, accompanied by a female chaperone, toured Millerite communities in Maine, including an eventful farmhouse meeting in Atkinson, led by Israel Damon. A year later, on August 30, 1846, James and Ellen were married by a justice of the peace in Portland. James later reflected, "We were married August 30, 1846, and from that hour to the present she has been my crown of rejoicing. It has been in the good providence of God that both of us had enjoyed a deep experience in the Advent movement. This experience was now needed as we should join our forces and, united, labor extensively from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific." Part 3, Prophetess or Not. From 1844 to 1863, White allegedly experienced between 100 and 200 visions, typically in public places and meeting halls. She experienced her first vision soon after the Millerite Great Disappointment of 1844. She said she had one that led to the writing of the Great Controversy at an Ohio funeral service held on a Sunday afternoon in March 1858 in the Lovett's Grove, now Bowling Green, Ohio, public school. This was an alleged vision of the ages-long conflict between Christ and his angels and Satan and his angels. J.N. Loughborough, who had seen Ellen G. White in vision 50 times since 1852, listed several physical characteristics that marked the visions. 1. In passing into vision, she gives 3 enrapturing shouts of glory, which echo and re-echo. The second, and especially the third, fainter but more thrilling than the first, the voice resembling that of one quite a distance from you and just going out of hearing. 2. For a few moments she would swoon, having no strength. Then she would be instantly filled with superhuman strength, sometimes rising to her feet and walking about the room. She frequently moved her hands, arms, and head in gestures that were free and graceful. But to whatever position she moved a hand or arm, it could not be hindered nor controlled by even the strongest person. In 1845, she held her parents' 18.5-pound family Bible in her outstretched left hand for half an hour. She weighed 80 pounds at the time. 3. She did not breathe during the entire period of a vision that ranged from 15 minutes to 3 hours. Yet her pulse beat regularly and her countenance remained pleasant as in the natural state. 4. Her eyes were always open without blinking. Her head was raised, looking upward with a pleasant expression as if staring intently at some distant object. Several physicians, at different times, conducted tests to check her lack of breathing and other physical phenomena. 5. She was utterly unconscious of everything transpiring around her and viewed herself as removed from this world and in the presence of heavenly beings. 6. When she came out of vision, all seemed total darkness, whether in the daytime or a well-lighted room at night. She would exclaim with a long-drawn sigh as she took her first natural breath, "Dia Arc." She was then limp and strengthless. Ellen's granddaughter, Martha Amadon, added, "There was never an excitement among those present during a vision. Nothing caused fear. It was a solemn, quiet scene." In December 1844, White experienced her first vision during a prayer meeting at the home of Mrs. Elizabeth Haynes in Portland, Maine, on the end of Danforth Street, just before Vaughan's Bridge, which crossed the Fore River. Ellen White described the occasion. "At this time I visited one of our Advent sisters, and in the morning we bowed around the family altar. It was not an exciting occasion, and there were but 5 of us present, all females. While praying, the power of God came upon me as I never had felt it before, and I was wrapped up in a vision of God's glory, and seemed to be rising higher and higher from the earth, and was shown something of the travels of the Advent people to the Holy City." After her first vision in 1844, Ellen G. White claimed to receive a series of follow-up revelations that would guide the developing Adventist faith. Her second and third visions reaffirmed her prophetic calling and the trials she would face, while urging her to share the messages she'd been shown. In February 1845, during what's known as the bridegroom vision in Exeter, Maine, she described seeing Christ entering the heavenly sanctuary, an image that reinforced Hiram Edson's interpretation of Daniel 8:14 and became central to Adventist theology. Over the next few years, Ellen's later visions, up to her 16th, expanded on key themes: the journey of the faithful to heaven, the Sabbath as God's true day of rest, the state of the dead, and vivid portrayals of the new earth, a physical paradise awaiting the redeemed. Each revelation strengthened her authority among early believers and helped solidify doctrines that distinguished Adventism from other post-Millerite groups. Then came one of her most influential experiences, the Otsego Vision of 1863, given at the home of Aaron Hilliard in Otsego, Michigan. In this vision, Ellen claimed divine instruction on health, the need for clean living, proper diet, rest, fresh air, and natural remedies. It marked the birth of the Adventist health reform movement, leading to the creation of sanitariums, vegetarian advocacy, and the Church's ongoing emphasis on physical wellness as a spiritual duty. News of Ellen White's visions spread quickly through the shattered Millerite community. Soon she was traveling throughout Maine and neighboring states, sharing her experiences with small groups of believers desperate for hope after the great disappointment. Her revelations remained mostly local until January 24, 1846, when her account of the first vision, a letter from Sister Harmon, was printed in the Day Star, a Millerite paper out of Cincinnati, edited by Enoch Jacobs. White had written privately to encourage Jacobs, insisting the letter was not intended for publication, but he printed it anyway. That single act launched her prophetic career. Over the following years, her early visions were reprinted and circulated widely, eventually compiled in her first book, A Sketch of the Christian Experience and Views of Ellen G. White, 1851. Interestingly, Ellen White wasn't the first Millerite to claim visions. Two men, William Ellis Foy and Hazen Foss, her brother-in-law's brother, had both reported divine revelations before she did. Adventist tradition later taught that these men rejected their prophetic calling and that the gift of prophecy was passed to Ellen White in their place, a transfer of divine responsibility that set her apart as the chosen messenger for the emerging Adventist movement. I could honestly do an entire episode just on Ellen White's supposed visions. They're that central and that controversial. If you'd like to see her that in depth, let me know down in the comments below. Part 4. Non-traditional beliefs. The Seventh-day Adventists didn't just tweak old doctrines. They rewired Christianity from the inside out. What began as a failed prophecy turned into a theological revolution. And while Adventists and Mormons took very different paths, both movements were born from the same 19th century impulse to fix what they saw as a broken Christianity by restoring God's true order before the end of days. But where Joseph Smith rebuilt Christianity on new scripture and priesthood authority, Ellen White's movement redefined it through reinterpretation. Instead of new revelation, she gave old prophecies new meaning. After Miller's failed prophecy in 1844, Adventists didn't abandon the date. They reframed it. They claimed that Christ had done something on October 22nd, just not what anyone expected. According to Hiram Edson's vision and Ellen White's confirmation, Jesus had entered the most holy place of a heavenly sanctuary to begin what they called the investigative judgment, a celestial audit of every human life, determining who was worthy of salvation. This became the cornerstone of Adventist theology, something found nowhere else in Christianity. For Protestants, Christ's work on the cross finished salvation. For Adventists, that work continued, quietly, behind the scenes in heaven. Sound familiar? Like Mormonism's proxy ordinances and records in heaven, this doctrine created a sense that spiritual progress was happening beyond human sight, in real time, under divine administration. Both faiths built a system where salvation required not just belief, but participation in their restored truth. Another major break came with the Sabbath. Most Christians worship on Sunday to honor Christ's resurrection, but Adventists rejected that, insisting the true biblical Sabbath was still the seventh day, Saturday. To them, this wasn't just a scheduling preference. It was a test of loyalty to God's law. Keeping the Sabbath became a badge of identity, the defining mark of the remnant church. Mormons, of course, also claimed to be the only true church, but their distinction was built on authority and ordinances. Adventists built theirs on obedience and time, literally marking themselves as separate by which day they worshipped. Both movements shared one conviction: everyone else was wrong. Then came another unorthodox idea: soul sleep. Adventists taught that when you die, you're not floating off to heaven or burning in hell. You're unconscious until the resurrection. There's no immortal soul. Death is a pause, not a passage. This rejected centuries of Christian tradition and made Adventists outcasts among evangelicals. To them, the idea of eternal torment was blasphemous. A loving God wouldn't burn his children forever. Mormonism took a softer path too, rejecting hellfire in favor of degrees of glory and second chances after death. Both systems challenged the brutal finality of traditional heaven and hell theology, replacing it with a God who was bureaucratic but fair, a God of process. In 1863, Ellen White claimed a vision in Otsego, Michigan, that would spark one of the most distinctive parts of Adventist culture: health reform. She taught that true holiness required care for the body, vegetarianism, abstinence from alcohol and tobacco, exercise, fresh air, and natural remedies. This was radical for the 19th century, and it birthed an entire medical movement. sanitariums, health retreats, and even the Kellogg Empire. If Mormonism built Zion cities, Adventism built hospitals. Both linked physical purity to spiritual worthiness. For Mormons, it was the word of wisdom. For Adventists, it was health reform. Both took private virtue and turned it into a measure of divine approval. At the heart of it all was identity. Adventists believed they were the remnant described in Revelation 12:17, the final, faithful few who keep the commandments of God and have the testimony of Jesus. This meant, in their eyes, that the rest of Christianity had fallen into apostasy. Catholics, Protestants, and everyone else. Again, the parallel to Mormonism is striking. Both movements claimed exclusive divine status. Both emerged from the same fractured religious landscape of the 1800s, and both offered certainty to believers who were drowning in spiritual confusion. For mainstream Christians, these groups were dangerous cults of reinterpretation. For their followers, they were the last light in a darkening world. The Seventh-day Adventists built their faith from the ashes of disappointment, shaping a religion that blended prophecy, discipline, and reform into something wholly new. They didn't just survive the great disappointment, they turned it into proof of divine purpose. And like Mormonism, that sense of being chosen in the end times would define everything that came after. I hope you learned something new. Smash that like button, hit subscribe, and follow for more no-fluff Ex-Mormon content that cuts through the faith-promoting fog. This has been the Ex-Mormon Informant channel, and I'm your co-podcaster, Sally, signing off.
Thank you for watching. This is the Ex-Mormon Informant, signing off.